My name is Andy Jones. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor and Deputy General Counsel at the CSU, and I am here today to introduce Dr. Barbara Kaufman, who's going to talk to us about building high-performing project teams, and specifically how to do so through the use of onboarding strategies. Dr. Kaufman is the president of ROI Consulting Group, and for over 25 years, she has worked as an executive, business coach, and educator to help organizations increase their leadership effectiveness and organizational capacity. As a trusted advisor to leaders and the nonprofit sector, she combines executive experience with research-based, pragmatic guidance in the areas of leadership effectiveness. Her areas of expertise include leadership effectiveness at the individual and team levels, executive coaching, high-performing teams, performance assessment for senior administrators, executive onboarding, shared governance, succession planning, board development, and many other related topics. Her clients include a wide range of organizations, including colleges and universities in 7 systems of higher education across the country. And now I've edited things out, so I will. Dr. Kaufman received her PhD from Claremont Graduate University, and she served as the leader in residence for the 1998-1999 academic year at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Leadership, located at the Peter Drucker School of Management, where she earned her master's in executive management. Dr. Kaufman occasionally serves as an adjunct professor there, where she teaches courses in leadership and talent management. She is a certified instructor in the use of connective leadership achieving styles model, and she is on the faculty of the Executive Leadership and Management Institute of the Western Association of College and University Business Officers. I'm sure I can go on and on and on and share many more impressive things about her, but I think it's time to let her share her ideas with us. Dr. Kaufman.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here this morning, but I want to start with a story about Mike Redman, and I'm so sorry he's not here to defend himself because he's helping another speaker. He said he was going to watch it on television with his father, so I'm not sure. But you all know how relentless he can be when he wants to get something done. So he called me and asked if I would speak today. And I said, Mike, I'm not a big data expert. I don't know that much about the cloud. I'm technically challenged. And I gave him all these reasons. Finally, he interrupted me and he said, no, I want you to talk about people. Oh, okay. If you think about what the last speaker said about how data are not consistent across systems, why do we think people would be consistent across systems and have the same worldview, the same global perspective? It doesn't happen. So the more we talked about it, I said, well, I have to see if I can move some things around. And then, of course, he does the guilt trip. You really, really, really need to do this for me, Barb. So I'm pleased that I could, because the more I thought about some of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years in the area of onboarding, the more I realized, well, of course it applies to project teams, no matter what label you stick on it, whether it's a synergy project or a committee, whether it's cross-system or cross-divisional. So what I want to do this morning, I'll give you the roadmap, is I have a couple charts that set the landscape. It should really just confirm what you already know. Then I want to talk about onboarding and how I'm defining onboarding. Then we'll get into the meat of it, some things I think you know well, but I'm going to talk about what happens when teams that are trying to work together with a common purpose become dysfunctional. What are the reasons? I see everybody's taking their pen out. What are the reasons they become dysfunctional? Maybe there'll be a few that you haven't experienced, maybe not. And then I want to talk about some very pragmatic strategies for how you can move ahead to create high-performing project management teams, rather than doing what Jim Collins calls a blameless autopsy at the end and finding out that people made faulty assumptions at the beginning, doing some work on the front end that saves a lot of time and effort on the back end. And I'm going to share with you a couple tools that I customized to be used for teams, which you're welcome to use, and a reading list, and just some things that I think will be helpful. I very much want this to be a conversation, so I'm happy to take questions as we move through it, rather than waiting until the end when we start to talk about how teams become dysfunctional and how you put them back together again. So in January, I don't know if you saw the Chronicle survey on innovation. Did anybody see that? They interviewed 350 university presidents. So the first bullet, not really a surprise. What I hear on campuses, if I think about the presidential or chancellors and the retreats that I do for them, suddenly they're talking about innovation and they're talking about creativity and how are we going to do things differently? How are we going to develop alternative streams of revenue? How are we going to cut costs? And sometimes we will spend most of the retreat talking about those things. So in this Chronicle survey, this should not surprise you that such a high percentage of presidents and chancellors think that the landscape is not going to look the same in 10 years. I think we know that, but I don't think 5 years ago this percentage would have been as high. This surprised me a little bit in terms of disruptive change. The number of presidents, 2/3, who favor either massive disruptive change or moderate change. Because I hear talk about it, but I don't see it very often on campus. I see some tinkering around the edges and certainly some interest level in it. And then 2/3 of the presidents surveyed said that the pace of change is so slow. The other thing they said in response to that question is not only the pace of change too slow, but it should be presidents, faculty, the campus community driving change, not the politicians. I thought that was an interesting one. Not government, not the politicians. This one blew me away. You may know that number. I did not know that number. But when you look at $33.8 billion and the fact that they're going to campuses with endowments over $1 billion, that I really stepped back and thought, okay, why in public higher education are we talking so regularly about alternative sources of revenue and finding creative ways to cut costs? Because so much of the money isn't going to you. Does that any of that surprise you? Confirm what you're hearing from your presidents and chancellors? Okay, I see some head nods. And I came across this quote in this book, Mining for Corporate Gold, but it resonated for me because I think too often teams focus on the mechanics of what they're trying to get done. You know, if I look at how people are promoted, for the most part, you can all think of a time when you were promoted because you got the task done. You got that initiative done. You got that problem solved. And so what I see very often is all these A-plus performers that I work with who are used to being right and used to doing a great job focus sometimes too much on the task and not enough on building the relationships on the front end. Not enough thinking about what's different about this campus, this culture, what's the shared governance model, what's the shared decision-making model. And that gets amplified when you put people together from different systems, from different campuses, sometimes from different divisions, sometimes from different departments. So what is onboarding? In the last, I would say 5 years ago, if I had used the term onboarding in higher education, I would have gotten a frown. Why are you using this corporate lingo with us, Kaufman? This isn't how we speak. I don't hear that today because I think that onboarding, as defined here, really, what are the interpersonal dynamics? What are the sacred cows? What is your shared governance model? What are expectations about shared decision-making? What are the traditions? A few years back, I interviewed all of CSU's presidents, and I asked them, knowing what you know today, what do you wish you had known in your first 6 months? And to a person, they told me a story about some cultural landmine or political landmine that they stepped on, that if someone had just told them the truth or given them the background, they could have dug themselves out of a hole. So think about the implications for that with project teams, that you come into a project team with your assumptions about your campus, your boss and what your boss wants, your constituent group, but I don't think it often gets talked about, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So some inconvenient truths. I think you know this, that the public-private partnerships, multi-campus partnerships are here to stay. Much of the retreat work I do, we are looking at a public-private partnership, and we're starting to step back and take a look at what is the end goal, not just from the campus perspective, but your partner's perspective. What are the roles? How are you going to move forward together? And I think we need to start thinking about these alliances as living systems, The fact that they're interdependent relationships. It's not just about the task or the goal of what you're trying to get done, because so much time can be wasted if you can't cement relationships on the project team before you tackle the task. I asked somebody the other day, tell me why you've been in existence for 18 months and you still can't seem to get to a decision point. And the answer I get most frequently for some version of that question is, well, we can't seem to reach consensus. Okay, what do you do when you can't reach consensus? What were the rules of engagement at the beginning? Were you going to go by majority rule? Were you going to take a vote? Were you going to go back to the champion and the champion would be the one to make the decision? How were you going to go about that? And what I see is you get stuck, but the team doesn't necessarily move beyond that. So team members, I think, need to be both teachers and learners. And the learning part, in my view, has to come at the beginning of the projects team work together, not midway through, not when the complaints come in about how one of your colleagues is behaving. And there were some funny stories in Stone Soup yesterday about what can happen with relationships when you have a cast of thousands and everybody has a point of view and everybody wants to be heard. And oh, by the way, everyone doesn't quite remember what happened in the meeting in the same way that you might. So we're going to talk about some of those things. So if you were in Stone Soup yesterday, this is an electronic bison, I suppose. You know, this is what happens when sometimes you have, you might feel like you're just tripping over a crack and the team rights itself and you move forward, but sometimes it truly is a train wreck. So I want to talk a little bit about the train wrecks I've seen over, Andy said 25 years, probably closer to 30. What do I see? And then we'll talk about what can we do about it. So this first one may seem like a given, the lack of agreed upon shared purpose, but I can tell you that it often isn't in writing. In other words, people come in with assumptions about there's been some high-level discussion about what you're going to get done in a synergy project or what you're going to get done in shared services. But what you don't get on the table is, okay, tell me exactly what your chancellor or your president or your division head or the CFO wants to get done. I can promise you if you line them up, if you've got 3 different systems or 3 different departments, you can't line them up without seeing, I believe, that there are some differences in the language. There are some differences in how people make sense of what their boss told them. And so what I see is, and we're going to talk about how to fix this, that there's often not, there are assumptions, but there is not a shared understanding of what the actual goal is or how you're expected to get there. So that's one thing that I see. The second thing, which shouldn't surprise you, is the competitive self-interest. You know, I know what's going to make my constituents happy. I know what I need to get done here, but I'm not really talking to you about how to create a win-win, or as one of the speakers said yesterday, a win-win-win, if you've got 3 systems involved. And so people come in more of an advocacy role for their constituent group than they do with a belief that this team now has to have a shared understanding about what the goal is, and the team needs to have a shared understanding about the constituent group. And closely fit with that is the issue of turf. The parochial views, the advocacy for your team, your division. Has anybody ever experienced that? I see head nods. I don't see hands up. So let me see some hands. I can't. Yeah, how could you not? And there's nothing Machiavellian in it. It's that I've come in with however many years on my campus, I've come in with the point of view from my department. That's my discipline, that's my technical expertise, and therefore that's the frame through which I am looking at this project. So how do you broaden that framing? How do you broaden, someone yesterday called it the global perspective. How do you get a dean who's advocate for his or her college to put their divisional hat on? They look at me like I've jumped in from Mars. But what I'm saying is take the advocacy hat off for what your college needs, because we're trying to look at resources from the perspective of the division and perhaps even for the campus. And I know one campus, San Marcos, where the president is very well known for her university first perspective. And when you go into a meeting with Karen Haynes, you better have that campus hat on and that university hat on and be thinking that way as a leader of that campus. Because the minute you go into the advocacy mode, you're going to get nailed. And she's going to ask you to come back to that institutional approach. So those are three of the things that I see. This is one I interviewed in preparation for the talk today. I'd say a half a dozen CFOs and some others in finance, and just said, tell me what you see. And they saw most of what I had on the first chart. But this one, I hadn't really given a lot of thought to unless I put my change management hat on. And what two of them talked about was this issue of there's this fear of a loss of resources or staff as a project outcome, and it goes unstated. So you go through this whole process of looking at shared services, but some of your team members are thinking about, how's this going to affect my staff? I see lots of head nods now. How is this going to? And this one CFO said to me, and what we don't do is get on the table, okay, but could we use attrition? Could we phase this in? Now, we're not going to talk about it now because we're still coming up with the strategy and what the service might look like. But to get on the table that we are going to look at the people side of what happens when you move together in a shared service environment. Somebody tell me a quick story about that, where you have seen this concern or fear that it's going to result in a layoff or it's going to result in people's jobs changing, and they may not think that they have the skill sets for it. And so some of their concerns are bubbling up really early in the project, either for themselves or perhaps for their team. Anybody have an example of that? Yes?
It's almost the opposite when you go, not so much the shared services, but when you go into a new project, I think the main thing that I hear is, that's going to be a lot of work. We don't have the resources. We can't do that. That's going to be extra work. And so you have to kind of step back and say, let's figure out how to do it, and then we'll figure out the resources. But that sometimes puts a cap on things.
Even at the beginning, because the project itself feels like more work, or the outcome feels like more work.
Right. But it's the people thinking, how is my staff going to, my staff has to handle this whole thing. And I'm like, no, let's go from there. So I think that is a fear that you have to address.
You make a wonderful point, because later you're going to see what happens when you're not helping people see how it might expand their portfolio and their skill sets. So maybe it's not a promotion in the classic sense, but it is actually an opportunity for them to learn and grow. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So that's a great add-on. Anybody else? Yes?
I just wanted to add to that many times they feel like they're losing control.
Great point.
And so if they don't have control and being able to check every little thing, then it comes back to that, trusting the other employees to do their job.
And it's a great point, because you're pushing them out of their comfort zone. And everyone, Change Management 101, you have to be able to answer the question, how is this going to affect me? And the second question, what's in it for me to pay attention here? And sometimes, if you peel back the layers, what I find is that it really is performance anxiety. It's because someone may feel that he or she, they're projecting that they aren't going to have the skill sets to do the new job, or they don't want to do the new job. But the performance anxiety piece is one that you really have to learn to get on the table, because if you don't, you're really not getting authentic feedback, because somebody is framing it through whether or not I'm going to be able to ultimately do that work. And so I hope you'll see, as we move through this, that using some basic onboarding techniques is a way to get those issues on the table. And when you do that, you can, if you're a student of nonverbal behavior, you can physically see people relax. The arms unfold. They're a little more expansive. They might take a deep breath, because you've actually identified one of their deepest fears, that I may not have the same role. And whatever their motivation is, whether it's the achievement motivation, whether it's status, something's going to change in their world. And it's something I think we really need to pay attention to. So my favorite. So in my coaching practice, I do a lot of work with individuals and teams on style flexibility. So we all have a preferred style, whether that's tackling the task and that gives you your sense of achievement, or you're someone that your first thought is, how can I bring a team together to collaborate on this? We all have a baseline preferred style. And so the intellectual arrogance, the head of the class model here, is one style that's an interesting one on project teams. Because if I'm used to being in charge, and whether that's position power that I'm playing that card, could be position power, it could be proximity to the boss, it could be a whole range of things. But if you get too many people on a project team and they all need to be head of the class, why are we surprised when the group dynamics begin to change? So that head of the class, knowing when somebody's in that mode and knowing that you can't have, yes, you have to look at skill sets, but you can't have everybody on the team who needs to be head of the class. And I think in higher education, because you're working typically with such bright people, enormous talent, they want and need to get an A+, that it is challenging sometimes not to be the one in charge. The second one is overutilizing a preferred style, that need to get in charge versus can't we all just get along? So you can't have too many people on the team who need to be in charge. You can't have too many people on the team who say, can't we all just get along? And let's just wait until we can build consensus. Because I can tell you firsthand from client feedback what happens when you just go with that build consensus approach and people feel like you aren't getting anything done. So understanding what are the different styles and approaches, it's like board development. So we're going to populate this board with people we know and people that we just know are going to do a great job on this board. Okay, let's take a look at a matrix here. Do you have anybody with the finance background? Have anybody with the marketing background? Have anybody with the fundraising background? Or are we all clustered in one group because we wanted to be on this board? And I see that happen every day. Well, teams are no different. What do you need on the team? Not just how many people do we need from each department, but what are the skill sets that we need on a team to be effective? Is that making sense to you? So I don't think we think about it overtly. We think about, I get along with someone, I do a good job with this person, yes.
I'll have to wait for my.
Sorry.
Okay, yes, you will, or we will not hear you.
Yeah, I'm a learning individual. So I appreciate this. I guess the observation I want to make is, don't the style differences diminish commensurate with people's understandings of how they're going to be held accountable working on that team?
I think,
Isn't that a great equalizer?
I think I would say it can be an equalizer, maybe not a great equalizer. Because even if I know what the expectations are, how, it's instead of the what, it's the how I choose to go about managing that team, how I go about it, we're back to I'm going to make certain assumptions. So give me a quick example of where you think the equalizer is that people are being held accountable for the same thing.
Well, you started to make comments about early on agreements on how we're going to make decisions. And I think if that's paired with understanding of how I'm going to hold you accountable as a member of a team, and we have that dialogue up front, I know going in what those expectations are. And style becomes in my experience, style becomes a much easier item to negotiate with those foundational ground rules understood. So I could give you examples. I don't want to overwhelm people because I'm on a very large project now, and I could probably cite examples
do I
all day.
think one of the key dimensions is accountability? Yes, accountability for behavior. But I don't think you can just look at the hardcore accountability dimension without spending some time on the people side of the equation in terms of how you're, but I think you're raising an important point. You have to have both, because the purpose isn't to just do kumbaya, the purpose is to get something done. So how do you take accountability and a deeper understanding of human nature and people styles and how they're likely to respond to certain situations? So good point, great point. So the intellectual arrogance we've talked about a little bit, the focus on task without adequate relationship building, and perhaps that also gets to your question. So we know we have a discipline, we know how to do something well, but I believe that often the task, if I look at my coaching practice, a very high percentage of time, it is not about what the individual is trying to do, it's about how they're doing it. It's about how they're making somebody feel, whether they're tapping into what that person can do well. It's about the relationship piece. It's rarely at that level about the task. We already know you can nail the task. But can you manage relationships effectively, whether it's a conflict resolution process, whether it's understanding the difference in styles? I think all those things factor in to how you can make teams work more effectively, just as you can at the individual level. Other comments or questions? Okay. This book, when it was in hardcover, Mistakes Were Made but Not by Me, is one of my favorites. The cover is yellow. You see 2 feet backed into a corner with a paintbrush, and there is no way out. And so it's now in paperback, and it is a great book because it is about what happens when somebody becomes hypercritical of the team or hypercritical of the skill sets, which I see all the time, and they move into a self-justification mode. And so you're not then talking about what it is you're going to do, but this person on the team is talking about why you have a wrong approach. So they're either externalizing blame or they're justifying their point of view. And what you're trying to do is tease that back so that in terms of giving and receiving feedback, team members are actually open to listening to other points of view rather than just trying to move forward with their point of view. I find that a lot of my clients who are A+ performers have maybe a little streak of perfectionism. So they know a right way to do something, and then they have cognitive blinders on because they have a right way to do something and they're going to do it. Versus maybe there are alternative ways of doing that. Is that making sense to you? You see that on the teams you're on at times? So Mistakes Were Made but Not by Me is a really interesting and challenging book, and I think can be helpful for teams. And then assuming that the leadership requirements are universal. I can't tell you the number of times I have to say to someone, I understand that these were the leadership requirements under the last administration, and maybe even the administration before that. But what you're not seeing is, it's not the expectation of your current boss. And so someone will say to me, but I know how to do this. I know what my job is. You knew what your job was under the prior administration. You haven't really tested whether or not under this new administration, whether it's a new chancellor, a new president, a new divisional head. And it amazes me how often we really don't get those issues on the table. That yes, I have a great grasp of what my role is, but I haven't fully tested whether my new boss would agree that this is my role in today's environment. Has anybody had that experience? Yes, George? Yes, yes, and yes? Well, give us a quick example.
And I take it to a further extreme, when leadership does change, folks that report directly to me are saying, what is the expectation? What is our role now? How is our role changed? And so it's up to me to find out and test the waters with management to say, hey, listen.
You're the translator.
I'm the translator.
You are
exactly.
absolutely the translator.
And I have to test the water and say, okay, this is what our role before. You know, I'm hearing a little something different. Am I interpreting what I'm hearing correctly or not? You know? And so, and that's something we've been going through, and it's exciting, and at the same time, it raises a little anxiety too.
Sure it does, because again, it's pushing you out a little bit out of your comfort zone. So if you think about that, when I say to someone, I know you do this really well, but that was for the prior administration. What I see is a shift, and it may not even be a shift in the portfolio, but it's a shift in what part of the portfolio the new boss is going to emphasize. Which part of the priorities is he or she going to emphasize? I have this conversation, as you can imagine, on quite a regular basis, even down to things like, which you can use with the project team, basic communication. When do you want to be notified on the weekend? Do you want to text? Do you want it to be email? What is your comfort level? And so these are real-time things that I'm finding more and more. If you talk about it on the front end, there's so much less anxiety on the back end. So if I'm doing interviews and I say, well, tell me about what your boss expects. What do you mean by that? Well, what does he or she expect in terms of communication? Well, My favorite answer, I'm trying to figure that out. But it's like said in a whisper. We're still working on that. Well, what gets in the way of answering? My two favorite responses, if he was smart enough to hire me, I should be smart enough to figure it out. And the second one is, I don't want to look stupid in front of my peers. So instead of asking, instead of exploring, and most leaders are very willing, and oh, by the way, most of these leaders will say, well, I thought it was pretty obvious what I wanted. Not really. And so the same thing applies, I think, to project teams. What's the communication level going to be? How are you going to support one another? What are the basic rules of engagement? Rather than just rolling your success strategies forward and making assumptions until you hit some kind of a roadblock. And then instead of the conflict, I'm going to show you a conflict model in a few minutes, instead of the conflict being at a task level, it devolves into a conflict that's about relationships. And that's exactly what you don't want. You want to keep the conflict as in healthy disagreements about opinions about how to do something. You want that conflict to be at the task level. Yeah.
Just one other thing. When you're approaching a project as complicated as this with 3 systems, there's going to be failures. But those failures should be expected because that's part of the journey.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so it's those. I mean, I think there has to be a way to accept those failures in a way that it doesn't discourage you from continuing the team effort.
And one way to do that is, I'll use the Jim Collins model again, something, not everybody likes the metaphor, but I happen to love it, the blameless autopsy. So if you take the time out to debrief and say around whatever that miss was, near miss or a failure, what assumptions did we make at the beginning? What assumptions did we make in the middle? And at the end, what did we learn and what we would do differently? Suddenly the team finds that it's okay to talk about a failure. So you're very right about that. Other examples? Yes. You've got to have a mic, otherwise it will not be picked up.
Hi. I'd just like to add to that I think that, from a project management standpoint, there are going to be failures, but I think as part of due diligence of a good project is that you would do a risk assessment at the beginning to try to identify with the team and with the key stakeholders, what could happen here? What are the possible things that could go wrong so that you can manage it ahead of time? And there should be no surprises.
Wonderful point. And when I have those discussions, I ask, so people get kind of energized by whatever it is, let's say they're going to do. Maybe you've gotten through that part. And then I'll say, well, what are the critical success factors? And what are the potential unintended consequences? So we keep those up on the wall to consider and to look at. And sometimes at the end, we'll do mind mapping so that through the eyes of different constituent groups, what would faculty, what would donors, depends on what the issue is, what are the different stakeholders, what are they going to say about this decision? What are they going to say the pros and cons are for this decision? And sometimes, believe it or not, it's as simple as language, that you can't say it the same way to each constituent group. So you're very right about being proactive about critical success factors, consequences, and getting those issues on the table. The other thing that does, if you have that discussion on the front end and you do some framing, is if you've ever worked with people that you're trying to stay at a strategy level first to do the blue sky, the brainstorming, and to get the ideas, but that person is all the way down to what the potential problem could be, you can point to that and say, yes, we're going to get to that. But that's not where we are right now. So good example. So institutional barriers that I've seen, the lack of buy-in and a clear project champion. This sounds so simple, but I have seen many occasions where a president asks a cabinet to do X, and after the president leaves the room, it's clear there's not buy-in. And sometimes it's not the what, sometimes it's actually the how. But getting buy-in and a clear project champion, who ultimately is the decision maker? Is it the project champion? Is it because going into it, when you hit those bumps along the way that there are differences of opinion, you may occasionally have to go back to that champion. But what I find is sometimes people don't realize who the champion is, or there are multiple champions, but one champion's very engaged and two others just figure they're champions as a figurehead, and they don't have a point of view until the decision gets made and you get closer to implementation. And so finding out who are the champions, are they on board with where we're going and how we're going to get there? The other question I ask the champion to ask, so often I'll say, as I did at a nonprofit research institute to the CEO, would you go in 15 minutes the first meeting? I want you to tell them, as you're asking them to look at the potential for combining educational practices across the institute, is there anything out of boundaries? Oh, he said, well, yeah, I don't really want them to look at this or that. Tell them that. You know, don't have them going down a pathway and then they've picked up some things that, for whatever reasons you're saying, are out of boundaries. What isn't out of boundaries that you absolutely are willing to look at lots of different ways? It was so energizing for the team to have the champion in the room saying, I want you to know the only thing out of boundaries is X. Anything else I'm open for. But this is a time-bound assignment, and I want recommendations by. And so there was clarity about what they were asked to do and clarity about what the expectations were. If that doesn't happen downstream, I see lots of problems. Valuing and rewarding individual performance versus team performance. So if I were to ask, could I see the performance review process? Tell me how. A few years ago, almost never did I see anything about team performance on the performance evaluation. So why would we expect somebody's going to put a lot of time and effort into being on this system team, or the two, I'm blocking on their names, but the two women in the stone soup, talking about a 5-year project. I think you were talking about it too, how many report outs. All that time and effort, if at some point they're not also going to be assessed on team performance or system initiatives. Agree, disagree, do you see that? So I go into my boss, but he's asking, did I get X done around this campus need? But he's not necessarily asking about the system team I'm on. And I think the most skilled presidents and chancellors who expect their teams to make a contribution at the system level, one campus in particular, at retreats we look at who's involved in what, and they're expecting regular report outs. Everything from the politics of it to how it's moving forward, what contribution and influence the team had. And so it's just amazes me that there is so little time spent on team performance versus individual performance. What is your experience? A couple stories about whether your boss is focused more, you don't have to say who your boss is, on individual performance or just in general, whether you have that experience or your own team say to you, that doesn't seem to be what you're evaluating me on. Anybody had that experience? Yes.
I appreciate that, but I was thinking, I think in our actual evaluation, we have a talk about interpersonal relationships and examples that says that coaches us kind of accuse us to mention teams when we do our evaluation for staff and everything. When it gets higher up in management, it's not, well, I don't know, I think it does on our evaluation. But anyway, so I think that's one thing that would be, if a campus doesn't have that, it would be a good thing to have some ideas how you participate on teams, because I've gotten them on mine and I know that I've seen it, given it to others, that they participate, because it's a time sucker, so you should get points for it.
And it isn't just about accountability, it's also about being valued and some type of intrinsic reward that your boss is at least asking. Did you have an example? You may not speak until you get the microphone. Kathy.
I'm going to need a microphone at work now. What this brought up to me was a task force that I'm leading that involves individuals from across different departments and the task force was initiated by the president, by Napolitano, but the individual bosses of the people on this task force were certainly not consulted prior to the task force being named and formed. And so their individual performance objectives and the goals that they created at the beginning of the last fiscal year did not include
this work.
At all. And so I find myself, for the most part, cooperatively, but working with them to make sure that this work matters not only for the work of the task force, but also within their departments and divisions.
Yeah, and sometimes it takes the champion to make clear or to send out regular messages about how important the work is. So this isn't a minor issue. I've got just a couple more, and then I want to hopefully spend the last 30 minutes on some tools for you. Cultural and political undiscussables, we've talked a little bit about this. So you get on the project team, but no one says specifically, look, my boss has told me that we absolutely have to have X. It doesn't get on the table. And so this tool that I'm going to show you in a minute, it's an interview for the project team, gets at some of these issues, gets them on the table. And then this one we talked about earlier in the presentation, the insufficient emphasis on the professional development opportunities. So if you want someone to be on one of these teams, it's going to suck the life out of you a day a week or 2 days a month or whatever it is for 5 years, wouldn't it be absolutely great if you could actually look at who to put on which teams, that it isn't just good for the institution, but it is some professional development opportunity that this person really wants. You know, in a time where the career trajectory may not be linear, but in fact, it's horizontal, but there are those opportunities. And I've seen people get really excited when they realized there was a skill set that they were learning, or it was another facet of their portfolio that they were emphasizing or growing in through some of the project team work that they were doing. They just hadn't thought about it. So if you can get people to also think about their own portfolios, their own professional development, and have them be more mindful and deliberate about the opportunities, sometimes that can shape not only their energy level, but it can shape the kind of work they want to do on the teams. Instead of staying in their comfort zone, maybe they're going to get out of their comfort zone and learn from someone else on the team in an area that they don't have the expertise, or they don't have the expertise at a level. It's like developing your own, when I do coaching, personal advisory board, little virtual personal advisory board around some areas that you're interested in or could be interested in. So it's a really neat thing to talk to people about and to get them focused on how the work, it isn't just more work, how that work on the team can actually benefit them as well. Is that making sense to you? We just don't talk about it. So I love this quote because I think it makes the case for onboarding for project teams. And it was back when, the healthcare went in, and nobody anticipated the problems, and no one was willing to say what exactly the size and scope of the implementation problems were going to be. I'm not suggesting that onboarding would have solved this, but I do think it makes the case that sometimes we get really far down the pathway before we start talking about what the unintended consequences could be, or maybe we didn't have a clear discussion about what the critical success factors were going to be. Maybe we didn't want to tell the champion that we can do it, but we can't do it in this time frame because we now understand the complexity of it, or here are the pros and cons of phasing it in. And it's having those more deliberate discussions. So I do think that when you think about onboarding, having more deliberate discussions is a way to do it. The other way to do it is starting with a small committed group. So if you think about it and you have a small steering committee, and the steering committee starts to work out some of the issues, and the steering committee, let's say, uses this tool that's coming up next, I think you then, as you're adding people to the team, instead of saying who's interested, who's got time this week, you've got a small steering committee looking at what's the charge, what are we trying to get done, what are the skill sets we need, not who's available, what are the skill sets we need. And then you start rounding out the team with the skill sets that you need. And I think too often we're looking for, and sometimes it's that same small group of people who are willing to say yes, right? The 80-20, the same people. What are the skill sets? And can you bring some people on the team where it might also be an unusual opportunity for them. Maybe it's a little bit of a stretch, but you think that they can do it. It's another way to add energy to the team. So onboarding tools. The first one is a tool that I created a very long time ago in my coaching practice, and started then to use it for onboarding, and I've customized it a bit, and there are 8 or 10 questions. So let's say you have this small team, and you're literally doing a round robin. What's your understanding of the project, desired outcome, and timeline? And you're going to get all these little oops, okay, that's not what I thought, but now you've got them lined up. Do you have buy-in from campus? Do you have buy-in from your champions? Who are your key constituents? If you think about UC, CSU, and community college, surely as you just go through that question, you're going to tease out differences. That maybe it isn't going to change what you do, but you need to be aware of it. That the constituent group is much broader than you anticipated. That you've only got buy-in from one major constituent group, but an unintended consequence is that the union's going to fight you tooth and nail, or faculty's going to fight you, or a group of administrators. And the second question then is, what are your strengths in contributing to the project team? And I love to ask the question, what are the strengths you overutilize? Think about that. You know, what do you love to do? I see some snickers and some light laughters, you know, whether it's I love to be in charge, or I love to plot it out, I love to do the spreadsheets, I love to talk about this. What do you tend to overutilize that might get in your way? Because I see this every day where someone is very good at the financial side, but really has a blind spot on the people side, or vice versa. Somebody comes in and they're thinking about what's going to happen to all these people, but they're not helping you think about what is the right pathway. So talking about what are your strengths, where do you think you might overutilize them or underutilize them, and how do you fill that skill gap? So you just don't have a team of the willing, but you have a team with the right skill sets. Is this making sense to you? Okay, I see lots of head nods. Can you see yourself using something like this? You know, a small team, you might spend an hour on these 8 or 10 questions, but I promise you, you will have a map of what that team looks like, and you will be able to extrapolate from these questions potential rules of engagement. That here are our strengths, you put the next one up. Here are the styles. We need to make a commitment to develop some style flexibility, because gee, surprise, this is a team and everyone on the team is used to being in charge. And now I might need to be in a contributory role because we've got a co-chair, or I'm not one of the chairs. And I can't suck all the oxygen out of the room every time we have a meeting with my point of view. I may need to get into a listening mode. It's having those discussions. How effective are you at giving and receiving feedback? You know, tell me about your campus, tell me about your department. Do you give each other feedback regularly? Because as we go through this process, we're certainly going to hit some bumps along the road where we're going to need to give each other feedback about what we're doing well. And we're going to need to be able to say, I think you're making some faulty assumptions about this, or I think you've just interrupted me and I'm trying to dig down a little and to give you more context for our decision. It has to be okay on project teams to give each other feedback. Have you ever run across any of those little bumps where there's a silence? Yes. But you cannot speak until you have the mic. Where's the mic? Here we go.
We're currently working on a sports club guide for the whole CSU system, and we've got different we have a small team, and then we've gone out to different constituents. Some of the bumps that we've encountered were just in writing the manual. We had a difference of opinion on a certain grammar style that really didn't make a big difference, but we wanted it consistent through the manual. So we disagreed, but you know, the person that felt the strongest, we just went with that person's view, and it's fine. It works out.
But those things can really be disruptive if you don't decide how long are you going to discuss it and at what point are you going to compromise. rather than trying to reach consensus. And then what we've been talking about, if there are differences of opinion, what model are you going to use? And I'm going to show you one in just a minute. How would you describe your campus culture related to decision making? What are the sacred cows? Those are really important questions to ask. Because if I come in with a decision making model that we always reach consensus, or we give input, but our boss really typically makes the decision, then that's going to be likely my expectation for this team. And it may not be the way you're operating. And by the way, you should know, is the champion asking you to make recommendations? A range of recommendations? Is the champion asking you for your top recommendations? Are they asking you for the pros and cons? Are they asking you for business? What are the expectations of the champion so that you don't get, and I've seen it, I can't tell you how many times, you get to the end and the champion says, this is not at all what I had in mind. Or you've only covered 3/4 of it, what happened to this piece? And the team is so deflated. They have spent so much time and effort. So find out those things on the front end. And especially the sacred cows, because there could be something within your project that faculty, staff, the president, someone in another system really says, this is not something we can touch. Yes, sir.
So it just occurred to me that we're putting a lot of emphasis on the champion, and some of their decision-making power. I've noticed, though, too, that a lot of times we don't necessarily have very good champions. How do you deal with that?
It's a great question. Sometimes, this is going to sound really simplistic, sometimes, I swear, it's simply because the champion hasn't been identified. Okay, so it turns out to be the team has to say you have to say to your boss, the CFO, are you actually the champion for this? Are we bringing the recommendations to you or the president? What's the president's level of awareness about this project? Is it a campus-wide, institutional-wide? Is it Bryce, Janet, Napolitano, and Tim? Are all three of them going to look at this? So I think sometimes one version is we don't know who the champion is with certainty as it relates to who's going to make the decisions. Other times you get a champion who says he or she is a champion. I suspect this is what you're talking about, but they're not very engaged. And then it becomes a little bit of a political dance, perhaps to ask one of the other champions to engage this person, or to see if among the champions there's one who's the super champion, and you can turn to that person to talk with the other two. But I don't disagree with you. You don't always have champions who are fully engaged until the final hour. And so I think you have to use a range of strategies to try to address it early when you realize that's happening. And that's part of what I don't see happening. Yes?
I would just like to add to that. It's been my experience that I think that sometimes the sponsors have really good intentions, or champion, I call them sponsors, champions, but I think sometimes they just don't know what the role is. They just don't know, that that we need this kind of communication, that you have to be active, you have to be up front and center, we have to have these communication events that we would like you to lead. So I think if, at the beginning with your project management, again, if you have a really strong list of what the expectations are for all of the roles that are on your project, then I think that goes a long way.
Absolutely. I'm going to show you a little chart I use for that. But you're raising a really important issue, and that is one way to find out how engaged the champion is the champion willing to meet early with the committee so that that steering committee, I'll just put that label on it, who's gone through that interview protocol, who's thought through what they need from the champion, from a role support perspective, can negotiate what you need and see what answers you get before you get too far down the pathway. Was there another comment or question? Yes, here and then here. Kathy, and then gentleman over here.
Your comment struck a nerve with me, and I was just going to say that I thought I've had occasion, and I know Mark has too, to write talking points for our project sponsors or champions to be used when the end around comes. It's not a matter of if,
Right.
but to, when people come into your office and tell you why this isn't going to work because they're especially special or because, whatever it.
Call that sandbagging.
Yes, the typical sandbagging, very good.
And this is when you need to be Captain Kirk and not the plucky sidekick that, beams down to the planet. You have to say no. And
Yeah. And if you had the ideal, you would periodically pull in the champion, not for hours, but pull that champion in or designate the chair of the steering committee to have some conversations along the way. Because if you get lucky, you have a champion or a sponsor who's getting feedback from you and can start to integrate some comments as he or she is regularly talking. I see some head nods. Don't forget, this is a really important initiative and the team is really doing great work and we're going to have some results 3 months down the road. So it's a continuation. It's not rocket science. It really is just a more deliberate approach so that you don't have nasty surprises at implementation time. And you're getting some feedback earlier rather than later. But all great. I'm sorry, yes.
So I don't really have a question. I have more of an observation from my own experience.
Sure.
When we're talking about champions. So I've been on a number of large projects, and my observation with large projects is that, as the scale and complexity of the project team increases, kind of like the basic laws of project physics break down, and you need more than one champion. You need
Agreed.
almost a cabinet and a team of champions that maybe roll up to the original.
Depending on the issue.
Yeah, and my experience is that if you still stay with like the one champion model for large projects, the project team is so far away, so many degrees away from the person who's providing guidance that the original context and purpose of the project gets lost and muddled because it's such a large, complex, almost organization on its own. Mm-hmm. And I really see this as a problem, at least in some of the projects I've worked on. I'm in the UC system, by the way. And some of the projects I've worked on, the people who are supposed to be the champion are kind of just sleepwalking through the project because it's not their project.
Yeah.
And I think the only way to fix that, and this is where my observation comes in, is to make an accountability structure amongst the champions of the project.
Something that Mark mentioned about accountability. And the other thing that you didn't mention that happens is that people leave organizations. And then suddenly you've got a champion who's no longer there, but that role hasn't been filled.
Right, and I think that good projects should stand on their own merits, and it doesn't matter if the person left or not. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times when a person leaves and it was their project, then the project goes with them.
So it really does take a lot of attention and a real deliberate approach to make sure you've got champions who are still fully engaged. I'm going to look at a couple more charts and 2 more quick tools in the time that we have left, but thank you all for the feedback. So the summary questions, knowing what you know today about each other, how can we develop rules of engagement? How can we define roles that minimize role ambiguity? Those are some things I'd like teams to ask once they've gone through that interview process. It's not cumbersome, it's a one-pager, but I've never had a team go through those questions that they haven't had ahas about how they're going to work together or things that they need to redefine. I'm going to go to 2 more tools very quickly. The second onboarding tool, there's an article, and I've got a reading list in the back, called the Conflict Competent Manager. And what I like about it is it's clean, it's easy to remember. And the other thing I like about it is the distinction between task conflict, so we're focused on the issues, we're focused on the kind of results we want to get, and relationship conflicts. And the hard work is staying at the task level so that the team and the relationships don't devolve to relationship conflicts, the heated emotions, et cetera. And so this just gives you a little grid to look at cool down, slow down, engage constructively. The article is a Harvard Business Review article. It's easy to, I like it for its simplicity. So you're not looking at multiple grids and different models and methodologies. It's just a nice, clean, if you think about using this for a project team, how do you understand other people's points of view? Inquire and actively listen, learn something, brainstorm. It's just a nice, clean, crisp conflict management model that I think works well with teams. And I'm going to move ahead because I want to save a little time for projects. This I've used for a number of years, and you probably can't read all of the lines, but it's not meant to be a PERT chart. It's not meant to be a basic project management tool. But what it does do is at the beginning of the project, who's the team leader, who are the members, who's the sponsor, who are the key constituents, and what is their role? So we go back to role. Is there someone who's the sole decision maker? Is it going to be a shared decision? Do you need others who are expert knowledge? Does somebody have veto? Who do you need to get on board? And we do use it as a worksheet at the very beginning of an initiative to say, do we have all the players? And are these the right players to do the best possible job? I find it's also a very handy tool to use, not just for large-scale projects, but if I have a campus team looking at a public-private partnership, what roles are people going to play? And is there someone who's actually going to function as a champion? So it's just I try to make these tools as pragmatic as possible. So I've shown you three. One is the onboarding tool, and you can customize the questions. The second is the conflict management tool, and the third is this onboarding tool. And the last thing is a reading list of a number of articles. I have quite a vast list of articles, but I pulled out some that I thought might be most helpful to you. Conflict Competent Leadership is on there. Thanks for the Feedback is a great book. It is fairly new. The Science and Art of Receiving Feedback Well. It's crisp, it's clean, and it gives lots of vignettes on how to give and receive feedback individually or for teams. I still like Patrick's book, The 5 Dysfunctions of Teams. I still think that's very relevant today. The Collaborative Imperative is an interesting article. My work on executive onboarding. And there's just so much literature. But what I find with teams is if you can pick just a couple articles or a couple things that help you with your methodology, then when issues begin, you have some tools that feel non-threatening. So rather than looking for a tool or, oops, I think we need a conflict management model because the last meeting didn't go so well, you're putting the rules of engagement in place earlier rather than later. Is that making sense? So we've got about 10 minutes. I think that the notion of onboarding for project management teams has really come into its own because you're doing so much more work, less as individual contributors and more as members of a team. And the minute you get, as you all know, more than 2 people, even 2 people, that's when the group dynamics start to come into play. So I hope that the tools that I've shared with you today and some of the ways in which teams can become dysfunctional and then functional after some discussion would be helpful to you. Other comments, other questions? Mark?
This has been very, very helpful, and I really like some of the specific questions in the questionnaire. Because
Yes.
I think I can immediately map them to
Yeah.
a lot of onboarding that I have to do for what I'm working on. I guess I'd appreciate your comments then on some of these activities or components, not as an initiating activity, but as part of a periodic health check.
Yeah, I like that. Sure, you could.
And so just have you used them in that way, or are there specific areas you've discussed today that we could incorporate into periodic health checks?
I think you could use it both ways. I've used sentences or questions that I've popped out, and I've come back to it because I see something slipping. But I like your idea of going through the process initially, and then the periodic health checks could be, if you've documented that, it would be so easy to then say, here are the rules of engagement, here are the things we committed to, here are the style differences we've seen. Okay, the health check would be, how are we doing? It's like rules of engagement when you bring them back and we say, how are we doing with this? With interrupting each other with faulty assumptions, with style differences. So I love the idea of a health check. I've done a lot of them at the end, but I like what you're saying about midpoint. It's a lot less threatening, and it feels a lot less remedial if just on a regular basis you're doing those health checks. Thank you, Mark. Someone else, yes.
I know you're speaking to project management, but all of this applies also to small
Absolutely.
committee teams, lean teams, and I work a lot
Absolutely.
with the lean teams that are working on smaller projects maybe. And using this set of questions, I can see it be very valuable. With the lean team, I go through that set of questions with the champions who's brought the project forward and wants to define it. So I'm curious, where do you see the team being involved with the
Those
order of when those questions should be? Should some of the employees within the process be discussing those questions before you have
Well,
that charter?
I think you could do it at 3 levels. You can, not to overdo it, or you may extrapolate certain questions for the champion. All right, so certain questions are going to be important for the champion. Are there boundaries? Are there not boundaries? What are we trying to accomplish? What's the time frame? What's the sense of urgency? So I didn't put every question on there, but those are some of the sub-questions I ask. The second time you would use it is when you're forming what I called the steering committee. You call it whatever you want, that first nucleus, and I would probably go through all of the questions. Because if you think about it, what you could use that for is, now you've got rules of engagement and you have something about roles. Now, remember I said you're kind of filling in the blanks with what other people do we need on the team? You'd want to use some of those questions with them. But the shorthand version would be, this is what we've talked about so far. How is this a fit for you? So we need these styles, these approaches on the team. We need these skill sets. We think you fit here. We'd love to have you on the team. So I think you can use it as multiple, and then Mark gave us another one, which is that kind of midpoint health check. So it should be used, in my view, as a menu of questions. And you can, I've customized it, I can't tell you how many times, but pick out what works for the team. But I do like your idea of doing it multiple levels with the champion, because if you've got a champion who's saying, he doesn't feel or she doesn't feel the same sense of urgency, or it's greater than what you anticipated, then you have to start negotiating what that timeline looks like, and you have to start negotiating what exactly you can get done in that time period. But it's a non-threatening way to put those issues on the table by something as simple as an interview protocol.
It's an excellent model with the lean, working with the executive team, finding out what their deliverables are, what the boundaries are and such. But then with the team, helping them understand why they're there, what role they have.
But
and
you might
take
dig down
off their executive hats if they're in
Right.
a leadership role, that type of thing. And then moving to, that's the mapping team, and then moving to the Kaizen teams who are actually implementing the different changes. I can see it being very effective.
And the
So,
two
thank you.
questions I have on, I think it's towards the end, on the project management teams and how it helps their portfolio, you would spend more time on that probably with the people you're bringing in to fill in the team, to help them understand what's in it for me, what are they getting out of it. And so depending on the level of team you're working with, you're going to pick and choose questions that are going to be most meaningful for the level of employee you're dealing with, if that's making sense to you.
I have one last comment,
Sure.
and then I'll give the mic up. Earlier, you were talking about team members and how well they work, collaborated and such. The term I tend to use, and I always get a laugh and it lightens the mood, is, okay, we've picked the team members here. Do they all play well together?
Yeah.
Some of them may have had lots of conflicts with working together, and you have to look at which one maybe needs to be a different member so the team's successful. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else? Yes, Kathy?
I should fully punch my ticket. Oh.
Yeah.
So the makeup of the team, I was going to come back to that anyway. You were talking about sort of, I translated it into sort of an ecosystem of participation and knowledge and styles, but they also have to play well together. I had somebody in IT that came to me and said, I'm impatient, I'm grumpy, I don't say things diplomatically, I don't think I should be on this
You've
team.
already said they're in IT.
Yeah, did I work that in?
Okay.
It wasn't Mark. And
But oh, it's sounding so familiar.
yes. But I said to him, I want you on the team because we're trying to question the status quo and we need to be quick, and so that could add to the team. Every now and then he's asked if I've reconsidered, but in a, offline, outside the team, and every now and then I've second guessed it. But I wonder if you could comment on the value or the detriment of someone who's...
That's an interesting one, and sometimes I will try to negotiate to get the person interested. Well, would you have Mark come in for just 2 of the meetings for his technical, even though we know that he's just really tough to deal with? Come in for a set role, and then maybe you can expand that role. Sometimes, to be frank, you have to find an alternative. Sometimes it is just not worth it, because what it does is shut down the dialogue, or if the person is from a position power perspective, if that person is higher in the hierarchy, then people will tend to I see head nods, oh my God, tolerate that behavior, and they're not going to call that behavior. And you really have to create team rules of engagement, and having somebody who's going to violate them on a consistent basis isn't worth it. But there might be a periodic role for that person to come in on. Then everybody says, well, okay, this person's coming in because he's the expert on X. And so they kind of put the style aside to get that information from the person. So it's another thing that I've seen work effectively. The worst thing is to force the person to be on the team on a regular basis, and all the energy gets drained from the room because of 1 or 2 individuals. Yes?
I've been on a number of work groups, and I've just wondered, has the idea ever come forward as part of a health check of the group or of the work to take a tally, like a vote, an anonymous vote, like with a jury or something? Because sometimes it's difficult for people, as you said, to come forward and provide their opinion about whether it's working or whether it's not. And, would something like that be useful, or has it ever been tried?
Here's what I don't like about anonymous. It's like a survey. Okay, I'm a 2.5 in communication. What does that mean? And so my first preference is that it is a round robin, and the chair does a little soft coaching beforehand, that we really want to get issues on the table. You don't have to point to an individual, but we're going to have a discussion, because the minute you go down the road that it's anonymous, okay, now you find out 3 things aren't working. How do you talk about why they're not working?
That's true.
If people haven't heard each other's points of view. And so I think surveys and anonymous on those kinds of teams encourage, I'll just say it, passive-aggressive behavior.
Okay.
And you don't want passive-aggressive behavior. You want to really encourage people to get issues. But I do think sometimes it takes some very quiet prep work to say to people that might be reluctant, I want to hear your voice. You don't have to name so-and-so, but the point you made the other day in the hallway with me about wasn't working, we really need to get on the table. Will you help me with that? So it does take a little bit of massaging and a little bit of work. If they don't get it on the table, then let's say I'm the chair, I might say, okay, something has come up that none of you have mentioned, but several of you have mentioned it to me in the hallway, so I'm going to put it on the table. That this aspect of the project doesn't seem to be working. And then, I try to come up with, we could do this, this, or this. What do you think would help in terms of team dynamics, get that aspect of our work back on track? And then sometimes you can get people to talk. So you have to try multiple ways, but I would not go down, my professional opinion, I would not go down the path of anonymous feedback. All right, we are right on the dot. Do we have one more quick question, and then we will close out? Right here.
From the UC system, and what I found, at least at my location and talking with my colleagues at the other locations, is that we've got probably along with everybody else, shrinking resources, folks focusing just on their sort of areas of expertise, and then they're put in charge of these major projects. And what I found to be more successful in our location, I think you highlighted it really well, was the task conflict versus the relationship conflict.
Yes.
In that the experts or those people leading those project pieces, having them be the project task folks, and then separating those people out from the actual people management and saying, you've really got to identify a person who is the people change manager, and then having those people do the coaching of all the different levels. And so what I was wondering was, what recommendations do you have in terms of separating those out for organizations that say, I'm the leader, I know what my people need, and I also know the projects. How do you approach that with that person, knowing that their capacity to address both really is challenged?
Privately. And so I might start out with, here's how I experience your strengths, and there are strengths we absolutely need on the team. But one of the things we need on the team is someone who's a little less, and sometimes I'll say a little less intimidating, or someone who's not at that level of position power, who really seems to be quite skilled at, end the sentence, helping people get issues on the table, helping us think through change. And I'd like, it's probably going to be a her, so I'll insult all the guys in the room. I'd like her or him to play that role. And so it can be really interesting when you do that early interview piece to try to sort through a couple roles. Sometimes someone emerges and you know that, and they become informally in that role. Or you could position it that as we move towards implementation, so-and-so really has some expertise at the people side of implementation, and we'd like to put her in that role to help us lead that part of it. Is it always going to work? No, if the person is higher in the organization or isn't very self-reflective. It may not work, but I always think it's worth a try. And my last attempt would be, if none of that works, is to try to position a couple people who are good at the people side to put some of those people questions on the table periodically so that they do have to get dealt with. I could talk about this for several more hours, but we're 3 minutes over, and I know you have a break and another speaker. So I thank you for having me here and for listening and for coming up with such wonderful questions to enrich the discussion. Thank you so much.